Most people think of Rolex as the ultimate luxury watch, something worn by presidents, billionaires, and famous people. But almost no one knows the surprising story of the man who made Rolex famous. It wasn't a rich businessman. It wasn't a well-known inventor. It was an orphan who started with nothing and built one of the biggest luxury brands in the world. This is the unbelievable story of Hans Wilsdorf, the forgotten genius behind Rolex. He wasn't born rich. He didn't inherit land or a company. His life actually began with heartbreak. Hans was born in 1881 in Bavaria. Before he even became a teenager, both of his parents had passed away. Imagine being a child with no parents, no clear future, and no support. While other kids were studying, playing, and living happily, Hans had to start his life from zero. He was sent to live with relatives and placed in a boarding school. But instead of giving up, he became stronger. Hans loved machines and precision. He was amazed at how tiny metal parts could come together to create a watch that measured time perfectly. Where most people saw a simple watch, Hans saw a living machine. As a teenager, he got a job at a Swiss company that exported watches. Every day, he checked the accuracy of hundreds of watches. To others, this was boring work, but for Hans, it was perfect training. He learned how watches worked, why they were good, and why they failed. And he discovered a big problem. Wristwatches were considered useless. In the early 1900s, real gentlemen used pocket watches. Wristwatches were small, weak, and not accurate. Experts said a wristwatch could never be as good as a pocket watch. But Hans didn't believe that. At the age of just 24, he moved to London and did something everyone thought was crazy. He started his own watch company with almost no money. People laughed at him. Who would buy wristwatches from a young foreigner? Why choose a small watch over a big pocket watch? To everyone, his business looked like certain failure. But Hans had a different vision. He believed the world was changing. People were becoming more active. Soldiers, athletes, travelers. They needed a watch that was tough, light, and always with them. They needed time on their wrist. He created a short, strong, easy-to-pronounce name, Rolex. Some say it sounded like a watch being wound. Others say it just felt powerful. But one thing is clear. This name would one day become famous everywhere. Even after creating the brand, the mission was incredibly difficult. If Rolex was going to be taken seriously, its watches needed to be more accurate than anything else. So Hans took a big risk. He asked the best Swiss movement makers to build the most precise mechanisms possible. They said it couldn't be done. He pushed anyway. Rolex wristwatches were tested using the same strict accuracy standards used for giant ship clocks that guided sailors across oceans. And then, the unbelievable happened. Rolex passed. Not once, many times, again and again. A wristwatch was finally as accurate as a pocket watch. Rolex wasn't just a new brand, it was a new era. But Hans wasn't finished. A watch also needed to survive real life. Rain, dust, heat, cold, anything. If people were going to rely on a wristwatch, it had to be tough. And this challenge would lead Hans to an invention that shocked the world and changed Rolex forever. Now, the world started noticing Rolex. Making wristwatches accurate was a big achievement, but Hans Wilsdorf wanted more. He wanted a watch that could survive everyday life. Rain, dust, sweat, storms. Watches usually died in those conditions. If even one drop of water entered, the watch was finished. Experts said a waterproof wristwatch was impossible, but Hans didn't listen. He wanted to make the impossible real. In 1926, Rolex introduced something no one had ever seen before, a fully waterproof watch. It had a screw-down case, a screw-down crown, and a metal shell that sealed everything inside. They called it the Rolex Oyster. But just saying waterproof wasn't enough. People needed proof. The world needed a big moment, something so undeniable that no one would ever doubt Rolex again. And Hans found the perfect person. Her name was Mercedes Gleitzer, a young British swimmer attempting something incredible, swimming across the freezing English Channel. Waves, storms, and icy temperatures made it one of the hardest swims in the world. Hans asked her to wear the Rolex Oyster the entire time. If the watch survived, the world would believe. The day came. Reporters, scientists, and crowds watched as Mercedes jumped into the freezing ocean. For more than 10 long hours, she fought strong currents and freezing water. The sea destroys anything weak. But when she reached land, exhausted and shaking, people looked at her wrist. The Oyster was still working perfectly. It didn't break. It didn't stop. A wristwatch had survived the ocean. Hans made sure everyone knew about it. The very next morning, Rolex bought the entire front page of London's Daily Mail, an extremely expensive advertisement. Millions of people saw a large picture of Mercedes proudly holding her Rolex Oyster. It was proof the world couldn't ignore. Rolex wasn't just selling watches anymore. Rolex was making history. Suddenly, Rolex wasn't just a small watch company. It became a rising leader in innovation. Everyone wanted an Oyster. Athletes wore them. Explorers relied on them. Pilots, divers, scientists, the bravest people in the world trusted Rolex on their wrists. But Hans had another challenge in mind. A watch that survived water was impressive, but it still had a weakness. You had to wind it every day. Many people forgot, or they wound it too much and broke it. A luxury watch that stops running is useless. So Hans asked a new question. What if a watch could wind itself? In 1931, Rolex introduced a breakthrough that changed watches forever. The world's first reliable self-winding system. No more winding, no more forgetting. The watch powered itself just by moving on your wrist. Simple, smart. And today, this technology is used in almost every automatic watch in the world. Year after year, Rolex kept pushing limits. When explorers climbed the Himalayas, they wore Rolex. When pilots flew faster and farther than ever before, they wore Rolex. During World War II, officers and soldiers trusted Rolex on missions where every second mattered. Rolex was no longer only luxury, it became a tool for heroes. Still, Hans stayed in the background. He didn't put his face in ads. He didn't chase fame. He let his watches prove their worth. While other brands chased glamour, Rolex chased perfection. But even after all this success, Hans wanted Rolex to become something bigger than a business. He wanted the brand to live forever, even after he was gone. And soon, he would make one of the most unusual and powerful decisions in business history, one that shaped Rolex long after his death. By this time, Rolex wasn't just a watch. It was a symbol of accuracy, bravery, and innovation. But Hans Wilsdorf wasn't interested in fame. He believed Rolex should represent something bigger, human achievement. Every time someone said, "That's impossible," Rolex tried to prove them wrong. In the 1950s, the world entered a new era of exploration. People were climbing higher, diving deeper, and flying farther than ever before. These extreme places were the perfect test. Heat, freezing cold, high pressure, conditions that destroyed normal watches. But Rolex saw this as an opportunity. If humans could reach these places, Rolex wanted to join them and record every second of history. In 1953, a team of climbers attempted something no one had ever done: reach the top of Mount Everest. Freezing temperatures, dangerous winds, and almost no oxygen made every step painful. But each climber wore a Rolex Oyster Perpetual. When they finally reached the top of the world, exhausted and frozen, the Rolex was still ticking perfectly. From that moment, a new legend was born, the Rolex Explorer. But the mountains weren't the only challenge. Deep in the ocean, divers faced huge pressure that crushed metal and destroyed machines. Salt water ruined everything. Darkness made the ocean even more dangerous. Hans and his engineers took on the challenge. They designed stronger crowns, tighter seals, and tougher glass. The result was the Rolex Submariner, the first watch truly built for the deep sea, not as jewelry, as equipment for survival. Soon, Navy divers, submarine crews, underwater photographers, and scientists trusted Rolex underwater. And when humans went even deeper, down to the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth, a special Rolex was attached to the deep-sea vessel. It sank miles below the ocean surface. When it came back up, the watch was scratched and beaten, but still running perfectly. That moment proved Rolex wasn't just luxury, it was engineering that defeated nature. Rolex traveled the world with explorers, climbers, soldiers, and scientists. It became a symbol of human strength and endurance. But Hans Wilsdorf was now an old man. He had built a giant company known across the planet. Any other businessman would pass that fortune to family, but Hans had no children, no one to inherit Rolex. So he made a decision almost no billionaire would ever make. In 1960, Hans Wilsdorf turned Rolex into a foundation. No shareholders, no private owner, no family collecting profits. From that day, Rolex belonged to itself. The company's money would be used to improve watches, pay workers well, support research, science, and charity. Hans didn't create Rolex to become rich. He created it to last forever. He died the same year. And Rolex didn't fall apart. It didn't get sold or destroyed. It stayed strong, protected by his vision. The orphan who once had nothing left behind something eternal. This was the moment Rolex became immortal. But the story was far from over. In the years ahead, Rolex wouldn't just survive history, it would shape culture, power, and status around the world. From presidents to athletes, movie stars to world leaders, Rolex would become the global symbol of success. And the legend was only getting bigger. When Hans Wilsdorf passed away, many people thought Rolex would eventually fade away. Most companies fall apart when their founder is gone. But Rolex did the opposite. It became stronger, smarter, and even more successful. That's because Hans didn't just create a product, he created a mindset, perfection, or nothing at all. Rolex entered a new age, an age of legends. Presidents wore Rolex while signing important decisions. Athletes wore Rolex while breaking world records. Celebrities wore it not just to show off, but because it symbolized hard work, discipline, and achievement. A Rolex wasn't just a watch anymore. It was a message. When Winston Churchill wore a Rolex, it stood for leadership during the toughest times of war. When Martin Luther King Jr. wore one, it represented courage in the fight for equality. After the US won the race to the moon, astronauts celebrated wearing Rolex watches. When actor Paul Newman wore a Rolex Daytona, it later became one of the most expensive watches ever sold, worth millions. The brand didn't need loud ads or huge marketing campaigns. Rolex had something more powerful, proof. People trusted Rolex because it survived the ocean, conquered mountains, and appeared on the wrists of history's greatest achievers. Every scratch and every dent on a Rolex wasn't damage, it was a story. Even when the world changed, when digital watches and phones took over timekeeping, Rolex refused to chase trends. While other companies created cheap, fast, mass-produced gadgets, Rolex stayed loyal to craftsmanship. Every watch was made slowly, by hand, with care. In a world obsessed with speed, Rolex showed that real quality takes time. That patience created something rare. Rolex watches didn't lose value. They became more valuable. People realized a Rolex wasn't just a purchase, it was an investment. Today, some Rolex models are so hard to get that waiting lists stretch for years. The fewer there are, the more people want them. And just like that, the dream of an orphan became the most respected watch on Earth. Today, Rolex sits at the top of luxury without making noise. No giant logos, no begging for attention. Just silence, precision, and reputation. That is Rolex power. And here's something most people don't know. Rolex is still a foundation. It doesn't belong to a billionaire or a family. No one takes the profits. The money goes back into research, workers, technology, and charity. Rolex supports science, education, ocean exploration, medical projects, and humanitarian work around the world. The company that began with an orphan now helps thousands of people. In a world full of brands trying to shout, Rolex stays quiet. In a world full of products that break, Rolex is built to last. In a world where success fades fast, Rolex stands for something timeless. All of this began with a boy who lost everything and rebuilt his life with steel, gears, and a dream nobody believed in. Hans Wilsdorf proved that greatness doesn't depend on where you come from, but on how far you're willing to go. He didn't just make a watch. He created a legend that measures every second of human history. That's why when someone wears a Rolex, they aren't just wearing a watch. They're wearing a story of courage, invention, risk, and resilience. The story of the orphan who turned time into history. And that is how Rolex became a global legend.